Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Liz Devens. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 2, Chapter 11. That which for Vronsky had been almost a whole year the one absorbing desire of his life, replacing all his old desires, that which for Anna had been an impossible, terrible, and even for that reason more entrancing dream of bliss, that desire had been fulfilled. He stood before her, pale, his lower jaw quivering, and besought her to be calm, not knowing how or why. "Anna, Anna," he said with a choking voice, "Anna, for pity's sake!" But the louder he spoke, the lower she dropped her once proud and gay, now shame-stricken head, and she bowed down and sank from the sofa where she was sitting, down on the floor, at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet if he had not held her. "My God, forgive me!" she said, sobbing, pressing his hands to her bosom. She felt so sinful, so guilty, that nothing was left her but to humiliate herself and beg forgiveness. And as now there was no one in her life but him, to him she addressed her prayer for forgiveness. Looking at him, she had a physical sense of her humiliation, and she could say nothing more. He felt what a murderer must feel when he sees the body he has robbed of life. That body, robbed by him of life, was their love, the first stage of their love. There was something awful and revolting in the memory of what had been bought at this fearful price of shame. Shame at their spiritual nakedness crushed her and infected him. But in spite of all the murderer's horror before the body of his victim, he must hack it to pieces, hide the body, must use what he has gained by his murder. And with fury, as it were with passion, the murderer falls on the body and drags it and hacks at it. So he covered her face and shoulders with kisses. She held his hand, it did not stir. Yes, these kisses, that is what has been bought by this shame. Yes, in one hand, which will always be mine, the hand of my accomplice. She lifted up that hand and kissed it. He sank on his knees and tried to see her face, but she hid it, and said nothing. At last, as though making an effort over herself, she got up and pushed him away. Her face was still as beautiful, but it was only the more pitiful for that. "All is over," she said. "I have nothing but you. Remember that. I can never forget what is my whole life, for one instance of this happiness." "Happiness!" she said with horror and loathing, and her horror unconsciously infected him. "For pity's sake, not a word more." She rose quickly and moved away from him. "Not a word more," she repeated, and with a look of chill despair, incomprehensible to him, she parted from him. She felt that at that moment she could not put into words the sense of shame, of rapture, and of horror at this stepping into a new life, and she did not want to speak of it, to vulgarize this feeling by inappropriate words. But later, too, and the next day, and the third day, she still found no words in which she could express the complexity of her feelings. Indeed, she could not even find thoughts in which she could clearly think out all that was in her soul. She said to herself, "No, just now I can't think of it, later on, when I am calmer." But this calm for thought never came. Every time the thought rose of what she had done and what would happen to her, and what she ought to do, a horror came over her, and she drove those thoughts away. "Later, later," she said, "when I am calmer." But in dreams, when she had no control over her thoughts, her position presented it to her in all its hideous nakedness. One dream haunted her almost every night. She dreamed that both were her husbands at once, that both were lavishing caresses on her. Alexey Alexandrovitch was weeping, kissing her hands, and saying, "How happy we are now." And Alexey Vronsky was there, laughing, that this was ever so much simpler, and that now both of them were happy and contented. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she awoke from it in terror. End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett, Book 2, Chapter 12. In the early days after his return from Moscow, whenever Levin shuddered and grew red, remembering the disgrace of his rejection, he said to himself, "This was just how I used to shudder and blush, thinking myself utterly lost, when I was plucked in physics and did not get my remove, and how I thought myself utterly ruined after I had mismanaged that affair of my sister's that she entrusted to me. And yet, now that years have passed, I recall it and wonder that it could distress me so much. It will be the same thing, too, with this trouble. Time will go by, and I shall not mind about this either." But 3 months had passed, and he had not left off minding about it, and it was as painful for him to think of it as it had been those first days. He could not be at peace because, after dreaming so long of family life, and feeling himself so ripe for it, he was still not married, and was further than ever from marriage. He was painfully conscious himself, as were all about him, that at his years it is not well for man to be alone. He remembered how before starting for Moscow he had once said to his cowman Nikolai, a simple-hearted peasant, whom he liked talking to, "Well, Nikolai, I mean to be married," and how Nikolai had promptly answered, as of a matter on which there could be no possible doubt, "And high time too, Konstantin Dmitrievitch." But marriage had now become further off than ever. The place was taken, and whenever he tried to imagine any of the girls he knew in that place, he felt that it was utterly impossible. Moreover, the recollection of that rejection and the part he had played in the affair tortured him with shame. However often he told himself that he was in no wise to blame in it, that recollection, like other humiliating reminiscences of a similar kind, made him twinge and blush. There had been in his past, as in every man's, actions recognized by him as bad, for which his conscience ought to have tormented him, but the memory of these actions gave him so much suffering as those trivial but humiliating reminiscences. These wounds never healed, and with these memories was now arranged his rejection and the pitiful position in which he must have appeared to others that evening. But time and work did their part. Bitter memories were more and more covered up by the incidents, paltry in his eyes, but really important, of his country life. Every week he thought less often of Kitty. He was patiently looking forward to the news that she was married, or just going to be married, hoping that such news would, like having a tooth out, completely cure him. Meanwhile spring came on, beautiful and kindly, without the delays and treacheries of spring. What of those rare springs in which plants, beasts, and man rejoice alike? This lovely spring roused Levin still more, and strengthened him in his resolution of renouncing all his past, and building up his lonely life firmly and independently. Though many of the plans with which he had returned to the country had not been carried out, still the most important resolution, that of purity, had been kept by him. He was free from that shame, which had usually harassed him after a fall, and he could look everyone straight in the face. In February he had received a letter from Marya Nikolaevna telling him that his brother Nikolai's health was getting worse, but that he would not take advice, and in consequence of this letter Levin went to Moscow to his brother's, and succeeded in persuading him to see a doctor, and to go to a watering place abroad. He succeeded so well in persuading his brother, and in lending him money for the journey without irritating him, that he was satisfied with himself in the matter. In addition to his farming, which called for special attention in the spring, and in addition to reading, Levin had begun that winter a work on agriculture, the plan of which turned on taking into account the character of the laborer on the land as one of the unalterable data of the question, like the climate and the soil, and consequently deducing all the principles of scientific culture, not simply from the data of soil and climate, but from the data of soil, climate, and a certain unalterable character of the laborer. Thus, in spite of his solitude, or in consequence of his solitude, his life was exceedingly full. Only rarely he suffered from an unsatisfied desire to communicate his stray ideas to someone besides Agafea Mihalovna. With her, indeed, he did not infrequently fell into discussion upon physics, the theory of agriculture, and especially philosophy. Philosophy was Agafea Mihalovna's favorite subject. Spring was slow in unfolding. For the last few weeks it had been steadily fine, frosty weather. In the daytime it thawed in the sun, but at night there were even 7 degrees of frost. There was such a frozen surface on the snow that they drove the wagons anywhere off the roads. Easter came in the snow. Then, all of a sudden, on Easter Monday, a warm wind sprang up, storm clouds swooped down, and for 3 days and 3 nights the warm, driving rain fell in streams. On Thursday the wind drooped, and a thick gray fog brooded over the land as though hiding the mysteries of the transformations that were being wrought in nature. Behind the fog there was the flowing of water, the cracking and floating of ice, the swift rush of turbid, foaming torrents. And on the following Monday in the evening the fog parted, the storm clouds split up into little curling crests of cloud, the sky cleared, and the real spring had come. In the morning the sun rose brilliant and quickly wore away the thin layer of ice that covered the water, and all the warm air was quivering with the steam that rose up from the quickened earth. The old grass looked greener, and the young grass thrust up its tiny blades. The buds of the guelder rose, and of the currant and the sticky birch buds were swollen with sap, and an exploring bee was humming about the golden blossoms that studded the willow. Larks trilled unseen above the velvety green fields and the ice-covered stubble land. Peewits wailed over the lowlands and marshes flooded by the pools. Cranes and wild geese flew high across the sky, uttering their spring calls. The cattle, bald in patches where the new hair had not grown yet, lowed in the pastures. The bow-legged lambs frisked round their bleating mothers. Nimble children ran about the drying paths, covered with the prints of bare feet. There was a merry chatter of peasant women over their linen at the pond, and the ring of axes in the yard, where the peasants were repairing plows and harrows. The real spring had come. End of chapter 12. Recording by Sarah Jane Zweer, Ponsavan Laos.
Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 2, Chapter 13. Levin put on his big boots, and, for the first time, a cloth jacket instead of his fur cloak, and went out to look after his farm, stepping over streams of water that flashed in the sunshine and dazzled his eyes, and treading 1 minute on ice and the next into sticky mud. Spring is the time of plans and projects, and as he came out into the farmyard, Levin, like a tree in spring that knows not what form will be taken by the young shoots and twigs imprisoned in its swelling buds, hardly knew what undertakings he was going to begin upon now in the farm work that was so dear to him. But he felt that he was full of the most splendid plans and projects. First of all, he went to the cattle. The cows had been let out into their paddock, and their smooth sides were already shining with their new sleek spring coats. They basked in the sunshine and lowed to go to the meadow. Levin gazed admiringly at the cows he knew so intimately, to the minutest detail of their condition, and gave orders for them to be driven out into the meadow and the calves to be let into the paddock. The herdsmen ran gaily to get ready for the meadow. The cowherd girls, picking up their petticoats, ran splashing through the mud with bare legs, still white, not yet brown from the sun, waving brushwood in their hands, chasing the calves that frolicked in the mirth of spring. After admiring the young ones of that year, who were particularly fine, the early calves were the size of a peasant's cow, and Papa's daughter, at 3 months old, was as big as a yearling. Levin gave orders for a trough to be brought out, and for them to be fed in the paddock. But it appeared that as the paddock had not been used during the winter, the hurdles made in the autumn for it were broken. He sent for the carpenter, who, according to his orders, ought to have been at work at the thrashing machine. But it appeared that the carpenter was repairing the harrows, which ought to have been repaired before Lent. This was very annoying to Levin. It was annoying to come upon that everlasting slovenliness in the farm work against which he had been striving with all his might for so many years. The hurdles, as he ascertained, being not wanted in winter, had been carried to the cart-horses' stable, and there broken, as they were of light construction, only meant for feeding calves. Moreover, it was apparent also that the harrows and all the agricultural implements, which he had directed to be looked over and repaired in the winter, for which very purpose he had hired 3 carpenters, had not been put into repair, and the harrows were being repaired when they ought to have been harrowing the field. Levin sent for his bailiff, but immediately went off himself to look for him. The bailiff, beaming all over, like every one that day, in a sheepskin bordered with astrachan, came out of the barn, twisting a bit of straw in his hands. "Why isn't the carpenter at the thrashing machine?" "Oh, I meant to tell you yesterday. The harrows want repairing. Here, it's time they got to work in the fields." "But what were they doing in the winter, then?" "But what did you want the carpenter for?" "Where are the hurdles for the calves' paddock?" "I ordered them to be got ready. What would you have with those peasants?" said the bailiff, with a wave of his hand. "It's not those peasants, but this bailiff," said Levin, getting angry. "Why, what do I keep you for?" he cried. But, bethinking himself that this would not help matters, he stopped short in the middle of a sentence, and merely sighed. "Well, what do you say? Can sowing begin?" he asked, after a pause. "Behind Turkin tomorrow, or the next day they might begin." "And the clover?" "I've sent Vasily and Mishka. They're sowing, only I don't know if they'll manage to get through. It's so slushy." "How many acres?" "About 15. "Why not sow all?" cried Levin. That they were only sowing the clover on 15 acres, not on all the 45, was still more annoying to him. Clover, as he knew, both from books and from his own experience, never did well except when it was sown as early as possible, almost in the snow, and yet Levin could never get this done. "There's no one to send. What would you have with such a set of peasants? 3 haven't turned up. And there's Semyon." "Well, you should have taken some men from the thatching." "And so I have, as it is." "Where are the peasants, then?" 5 are making compote," which meant compost. 4 are shifting the oats for fear of a touch of mildew, Konstantin Dmitrievitch. Levin knew very well that a touch of mildew meant that his English seed oats were already ruined. Again they had not done as he had ordered. "Why, but I told you during Lent to put in pipes." "Don't put yourself out. We shall get it all done in time." Levin waved his hand angrily, went into the granary to glance at the oats, and then to the stable. The oats were not yet spoiled, but the peasants were carrying the oats in spades when they might simply let them slide down into the lower granary, and, arranging for this to be done, and taking 2 workmen from there for sowing clover, Levin got over his vexation with the bailiff. Indeed, it was such a lovely day that one could not be angry. "Ignat!" he called to the coachman, who, with his sleeves tucked up, was washing the carriage wheels. "Saddle me." "Which, sir?" "Well, let it be Kolpik." "Yes, sir." While they were saddling his horse, Levin again called up the bailiff, who was hanging about in sight, to make it up with him, and began talking to him about the spring operations before them and his plans for the farm. The wagons were to begin carting manure earlier, so as to get all done before the early mowing, and the plowing of the further land to go on without a break, so as to let it ripen lying fallow, and the mowing to be all done by hired labor, not on half profits. The bailiff listened attentively, and obviously made an effort to approve of his employer's projects, but still he had that look Levin knew so well, that always irritated him, a look of hopelessness and despondency. That look said, "That's all very well, but as God wills." Nothing mortified Levin so much as that tone, but it was the tone common to all the bailiffs he had ever had. They had all taken up that attitude to his plans, and so now he was not angered by it, but mortified, and felt all the more roused to struggle against this, as it seemed, elemental force, continually ranged against him, for which he could find no other expression than "as God wills." "If we can manage it, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," said the bailiff. "Why ever shouldn't you manage it? We positively must have another 15 laborers, and they don't turn up. There were some here today asking 70 roubles for the summer." Levin was silent. Again he was brought face to face with that opposing force. He knew that however much they tried, they could not hire more than 40, 37 perhaps, or 38 laborers for a reasonable sum. Some 40 had been taken on, and there were no more. But still he could not help struggling against it. "Send to Surrey, to Chelfveroka. If they don't come, we must look for them." "Oh, I'll send, to be sure," said Vasily Fedorovitch despondently. "But there are the horses, too. They're not good for much." "We'll get some more. I know, of course," Levin added laughing, "you always want to do with as little and as poor quality as possible. But this year I'm not going to let you have things your own way. I'll see to everything myself." "Why, I don't think you take much rest as it is. It cheers us up to work under the master's eye. So they're sowing clover behind the birchdale. I'll go and have a look at them," he said, getting on to the little bay cob, Kolpik, who was led up by the coachman. "You can't get across the streams, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," the coachman shouted. "All right, I'll go by the forest." And Levin rode through the slush of the farmyard to the gate, and out into the open country, his good little horse, after his long inactivity, stepping out gallantly, snorting over the pools, and asking, as it were, for guidance. If Levin had felt happy before, in the cattle pens and farmyard, he felt happier yet in the open country, swaying rhythmically with the ambling paces of his good little cob, drinking in the warm yet fresh scent of the snow and the air, as he rode through his forest over the crumbling, wasted snow, still left in parts, and covered with dissolving tracks. He rejoiced over every tree, with the moss reviving on its bark and the buds swelling on its shoots. When he came out of the forest, in the immense plain before him, his grass fields stretched in an unbroken carpet of green, without one bare place or swamp, only spotted here and there in the hollows with patches of melting snow. He was not put out of temper even by the sight of the peasants' horses and colts trampling down his young grass. He told a peasant he met to drive them out, nor by the sarcastic and stupid reply of the peasant Ipat, whom he met on the way, and asked, "Well, Ipat, shall we soon be sowing?" "We must get the plowing done first, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," answered Ipat. The further he rode, the happier he became, and plans for the land rose to his mind, each better than the last: to plant all his fields with hedges along the southern borders, so that the snow should not lie under them; to divide them up into 6 fields of arable and 3 of pasture and hay; to build a cattle yard at the further end of the estate, and to dig a pond and to construct movable pens for the cattle, as a means of manuring the land. And then 800 acres of wheat, 300 of potatoes, and 400 of clover, and not 1 acre exhausted. Absorbed in such dreams, carefully keeping his horse by the hedges so as not to trample his young crops, he rode up to the laborers who had been sent to sow clover. A cart with the seed in it was standing, not at the edge, but in the middle of the crop, and the winter corn had been torn up by the wheels and trampled by the horse. Both the laborers were sitting in the hedge, probably smoking a pipe together. The earth in the cart, with which the seed was mixed, was not crushed to powder, but crusted together or adhering in clods. Seeing the master, the laborer, Vasily, went towards the cart, while Mishka set to work sowing. This was not as it should be, but with the laborers Levin seldom lost his temper. When Vasily came up, Levin told him to lead the horse to the hedge. "It's all right, sir. It'll spring up again," responded Vasily. "Please don't argue," said Levin, "but do as you're told." "Yes, sir," answered Vasily, and he took the horse's head. "What a sowing, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," he said, hesitating. "First rate, only it's a work to get about. You drag a ton of earth on your shoes." "Why is it you have earth that's not sifted?" said Levin. "Well, we crumble it up," answered Vasily, taking up some seed and rolling the earth in his palms. Vasily was not to blame for their having filled up his cart with unsifted earth, but still it was annoying. Levin had more than once already tried a way he knew for stifling his anger, and turning all that seemed dark right again, and he tried that way now. He watched how Mishka strode along, swinging the huge clods of earth that clung to each foot, and getting off his horse, he took the sieve from Vasily and started sowing himself. "Where did you stop?" Vasily pointed to the mark with his foot, and Levin went forward as best he could, scattering the seed on the land. Walking was as difficult as on a bog, and by the time Levin had ended the row he was in a great heat, and he stopped and gave up the sieve to Vasily. "Well, master, when summer's here, mind you don't scold me for these rows," said Vasily. "Eh?" said Levin cheerily, already feeling the effect of his method. "Well, you'll see in the summer-time. It'll look different. Look you where I sowed last spring, how I did work at it. I do my best, Konstantin Dmitrievitch. D'ye see? As I would for my own father. I don't like bad work myself, nor would I let another man do it. What's good for the master's good for us too. To look out yonder now," said Vasily, pointing, "it does one's heart good." "It's a lovely spring, Vasily." "Why, it's a spring such as the old men don't remember the like of. I was up home. An old man up there has sown wheat too, about an acre of it. He was saying you wouldn't know it from rye." "Have you been sowing wheat long?" "Why, sir, it was you taught us the year before last. You gave me 2 measures. We sold about 8 bushels and sowed a rood." "Well, mind you crumble up the clods," said Levin, going towards his horse, "and keep an eye on Mishka. And if there's a good crop you shall have half a ruble for every acre." "Humbly thankful. We are very well content, sir, as it is." Levin got on his horse and rode towards the field where was last year's clover, and the one which was plowed ready for the spring corn. The crop of clover coming up in the stubble was magnificent. It had survived everything, and stood up vividly green through the broken stalks of last year's wheat. The horse sank in up to the pasterns, and he drew each hoof with a sucking sound out of the half-thawed ground. Over the plowland riding was utterly impossible. The horse could only keep a foothold where there was ice, and in the thawing furrows he sank deep in at each step. The plowland was in splendid condition. In a couple of days it would be fit for harrowing and sowing. Everything was capital, everything was cheering. Levin rode back across the streams, hoping the water would have gone down, and he did in fact get across, and startled 2 ducks. "There must be snipe too," he thought, and just as he reached the turning homewards, he met the forest keeper, who confirmed his theory about the snipe. Levin went home at a trot, so as to have time to eat his dinner and get his gun ready for the evening. End of Chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Bolin. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 2, Chapter 14. As he rode up to the house in the happiest frame of mind, Levin heard the bell ring at the side of the principal entrance of the house. Yes, that's someone from the railway station, he thought. Just the time to be here from the Moscow train. Who could it be? What if it's Brother Nikolai? He did say, maybe I'll go to the waters, or maybe I'll come down to you. He felt dismayed and vexed for the first minute, that his brother Nikolai's presence should come to disturb his happy mood of spring. But he felt ashamed of the feeling, and at once he opened, as it were, the arms of his soul, and with a softened feeling of joy and expectation, now he hoped with all his heart that it was his brother. He pricked up his horse, and riding from behind the acacias he saw a hired 3-horse sledge from the railway station, and a gentleman in a fur coat. It was not his brother. Oh, if it were only some nice person one could talk to a little, he thought. Ah, cried Levin joyfully, flinging up both his hands. Here's a delightful visitor. Ah, how glad I am to see you, he shouted, recognizing Stepan Arkadyevitch. I shall find out for certain whether she's married, whether she's going to be married, he thought. And on that delicious spring day he felt that the thought of her did not hurt him at all. Well, you didn't expect me, eh? Said Stepan Arkadyevitch, getting out of the sledge, splashed with mud on the bridge of his nose, on his cheek, and on his eyebrows, but radiant with health and good spirits. I've come to see you, in the first place, he said, embracing and kissing him, to have some stand shooting second, and to sell the forest at Ergushovo third. Delightful! What a spring we're having! However did you get along in a sledge? In a cart it would have been worse still, Konstantin Dmitrievitch, answered the driver, who knew him. Well, I'm very, very glad to see you, said Levin, with a genuine smile of childlike delight. Levin led his friend to the room set apart for visitors, where Stepan Arkadyevitch's things were carried also, a bag, a gun in a case, a satchel for cigars. Leaving him there to wash and change his clothes, Levin went off to the counting-house to speak about the ploughing and clover. Agafea Mihalovna, always very anxious for the credit of the house, met him in the hall with inquiries about dinner. Do just as you like, only let it be as soon as possible, he said, and went to the bailiff. When he came back, Stepan Arkadyevitch, washed and combed, came out of his room with a beaming smile, and they went upstairs together. Well, I'm glad I managed to get away to you. Now I shall understand what the mysterious business is that you are always absorbed in here. No, really, I envy you. What a house! How nice it all is! So bright! So cheerful! Said Stepan Arkadyevitch, forgetting that it was not always spring and fine weather like that day. And your nurse is simply charming. A pretty maid in an apron might be even more agreeable, perhaps, but for your severe monastic style it does very well. Stepan Arkadyevitch told him many interesting pieces of news. Especially interesting to Levin was the news that his brother Sergei Ivanovitch was intending to pay him a visit in the summer. Not one word did Stepan Arkadyevitch say in reference to Kitty and the Cherbatskys. He merely gave him greetings from his wife. Levin was grateful to him for his delicacy, and was very glad of his visitor. As always happened with him during his solitude, a mass of ideas and feelings had been accumulating within him, which he could not communicate to those about him. And now he poured out upon Stepan Arkadyevitch his poetic joy in the spring, and his failures and plans for the land, and his thoughts and criticisms on the books he had been reading, and the idea of his own book, the basis of which really was, though he was unaware of it himself, a criticism of all the old books on agriculture. Stepan Arkadyevitch, always charming, understanding everything at the slightest reference, was particularly charming on this visit, and Levin noticed in him a special tenderness, as it were, and a new tone of respect that flattered him. The efforts of Agafea Mihalovna and the cook, that the dinner should be particularly good, only ended in the two famished friends attacking the preliminary course, eating a great deal of bread and butter, salt goose, and salted mushrooms, and in Levin's finally ordering the soup to be served without the accompaniment of little pies with which the cook had particularly meant to impress their visitor. But though Stepan Arkadyevitch was accustomed to very different dinners, he thought everything excellent, the herb brandy, and the bread, and the butter, and above all the salt goose and the mushrooms, and the nettle soup, and the chicken and white sauce, and the white Crimean wine. Everything was superb and delicious. "Splendid, splendid," he said, lighting a fat cigar after the roast. "I feel as if, coming to you, I had landed on a peaceful shore after the noise and jolting of a steamer." "And so you maintain that the laborer himself is an element to be studied, and to regulate the choice of methods in agriculture." "Of course, I'm an ignorant outsider, but I should fancy theory and its application will have its influence on the laborer too." "Yes, but wait a bit. I'm not talking of political economy. I'm talking of the science of agriculture. It ought to be like the natural sciences, to observe given phenomena and the laborer in his economic, ethnographical—" At that instant Agafea Mihalovna came in with jam. "Oh, Agafea Mihalovna," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, kissing the tips of his plump fingers. "What salt goose, what herb brandy!" "What do you think? Isn't it time to start, Kostya?" he added. Levin looked out the window at the sun sinking behind the bare tree-tops of the forest. "Yes, it's time," he said. "Kozma, get ready the trap," and he ran downstairs. Stepan Arkadyevitch, going down, carefully took the canvas cover off his varnished gun case with his own hands, and, opening it, began to get ready his expensive new-fashioned gun. Kozma, who already scented a big tip, never left Stepan Arkadyevitch's side, and put on him both his stockings and boots, a task which Stepan Arkadyevitch readily left him. "Kostya, give orders that if the merchant Ryabnin comes—" "I told him to come today. He's to be brought in, and to wait for me." "Why, do you mean to say you're selling the forest to Ryabnin?" "Yes. Do you know him?" "To be sure I do. I've had to do business with him, positively and conclusively." Stepan Arkadyevitch laughed. Positively and conclusively were the merchant's favorite words. "Yes, it's wonderfully funny the way he talks. She knows where her master's going," he added, patting Laska, who hung about Levin, whining and licking his hands, his boots, and his gun. The trap was already at the steps when they went out. "I told them to bring the trap round. Or would you rather walk?" "No, we'd better drive," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, getting into the trap. He sat down, tucked the tiger-skin rug round him, and lighted a cigar. "How is it you don't smoke? A cigar is a sort of a thing, not exactly a pleasure, but the crown and outward sign of pleasure. Come, this is life! How splendid it is! This is how I should like to live." "Why, who prevents you?" said Levin, smiling. "No, you're a lucky man. You've got everything you like. You like horses, and you have them. Dogs, you have them. Shooting, you have it. Farming, you have it." "Perhaps because I rejoice in what I have, and don't fret for what I haven't," said Levin, thinking of Kitty. Stepan Arkadyevitch comprehended, looked at him, but said nothing. Levin was grateful to Oblonsky for noticing, with his never-failing tact, that he dreaded conversation about the Shtcherbatskys, and so saying nothing about them. But now Levin was longing to find out what was tormenting him so, yet he had not the courage to begin. "Come, tell me how things are going with you," said Levin, bethinking himself that it was not nice of him to think only of himself. Stepan Arkadyevitch's eyes sparkled merrily. You don't admit, I know, that one can be fond of new rolls when one has had one's rations of bread. To your mind it's a crime. But I don't count life as life without love, he said, taking Levin's question his own way. What am I to do? I'm made that way. And really, one does so little harm to anyone and gives oneself so much pleasure. What? Is there something new, then? Queried Levin. Yes, my boy, there is. There, do you see? You know the type of Ossian's woman. Women such as one sees in dreams. Well, these women are sometimes to be met in reality, and these women are terrible. Woman, don't you know, is such a subject that however much you study it, it's always perfectly new. Well then, it would be better not to study it. No. Some mathematician has said that enjoyment lies in the search for truth, not in the finding it. Levin listened in silence. In spite of all the efforts he made, he could not in the least enter into the feelings of his friend and understand his sentiments and the charm of studying such women.
End of chapter 14. Recording by Jonathan Poland.
Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 2, Chapter 15. The place fixed on for the stand shooting was not far above a stream in a little aspen copse. On reaching the copse, Levin got out of the trap and led Oblonsky to a corner of a mossy, swampy glade, already quite free from snow. He went back himself to a double birch tree on the other side, and, leaning his gun on the fork of a dead lower branch, he took off his full overcoat, fastened his belt again, and worked his arms to see if they were free. Grey old Laska, who had followed them, sat down warily opposite him and pricked up her ears. The sun was setting behind a thick forest, and in the glow of sunset the birch trees, dotted about in the aspen copse, stood out clearly with their hanging twigs, and their buds swollen almost to bursting. From the thickest parts of the copse, where the snow still remained, came the faint sound of narrow, winding threads of water running away. Tiny birds twittered and now and then fluttered from tree to tree. In the pauses of complete stillness, there came the rustle of last year's leaves, stirred by the thawing of the earth and the growth of the grass. Imagine, one can hear and see the grass growing, Levin said to himself, noticing a wet, slate-colored aspen leaf moving beside a blade of young grass. He stood, listened, and gazed sometimes down at the wet, mossy ground, sometimes at Laska, listening all alert, sometimes at the sea of bare tree-tops that stretched on the slope below him, sometimes at the darkening sky, covered with white streaks of cloud. A hawk flew high over a forest far away with a slow sweep of its wings. Another flew with exactly the same motion in the same direction and vanished. The birds twittered more and more loudly and busily in the thicket. An owl hooted not far off, and Laska, starting, stepped cautiously a few steps forward, and putting her head on one side, began to listen intently. Beyond the stream was heard the cuckoo. Twice she uttered her usual cuckoo call, and then gave a hoarse, hurried call, and broke down. "Imagine, the cuckoo already," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, coming out from behind a bush. "Yes, I hear it," answered Levin, reluctantly breaking the stillness with his voice, which sounded disagreeable to himself. "Now it's coming." Stepan Arkadyevitch's figure again went behind the bush, and Levin saw nothing but the bright flash of a match, followed by the red glow and blue smoke of a cigarette. Tch, tch, came the snapping sound of Stepan Arkadyevitch cocking his gun. "What's that cry?" asked Oblonsky, drawing Levin's attention to a prolonged cry, as though a colt were whinnying in a high voice in play. "Oh, don't you know it? That's the hare. But enough talking. Listen, it's flying," almost shrieked Levin, cocking his gun. They heard a shrill whistle in the distance, and in the exact time so well known to the sportsman, 2 seconds later, another, a third, and after the third whistle, the hoarse guttural cry could be heard. Levin looked about him to right and to left, and there, just facing him against the dusky blue sky above the confused mass of tender shoots of the aspens, he saw the flying bird. It was flying straight towards him. The guttural cry, like the even tearing of some strong stuff, sounded close to his ear. The long beak and neck of the bird could be seen, and at the very instant when Levin was taking aim, behind the bush where Oblonsky stood, there was a flash of red lightning. The bird dropped like an arrow, and darted upwards again. Again came the red flash and the sound of a blow, and fluttering its wings as though trying to keep up in the air, the bird halted, stopped still an instant, and fell with a heavy splash on the slushy ground. "Can I have missed it?" shouted Stepan Arkadyevitch, who could not see for the smoke. "Here it is," said Levin, pointing to Laska, who, with one ear raised, wagging the end of her shaggy tail, came slowly back as though she would prolong the pleasure, and as it were smiling, brought the dead bird to her master. "Well, I'm glad you were successful," said Levin, who at the same time had a sense of envy that he had not succeeded in shooting the snipe. "It was a bad shot from the right barrel," responded Stepan Arkadyevitch, loading his gun. "Sh! It's flying." The shrill whistles rapidly following one another were heard again. 2 snipe, playing and chasing one another, and only whistling, not crying, flew straight at the very heads of the sportsmen. There was the report of 4 shots, and like swallows the snipe turned swift somersaults in the air and vanished from sight. The stand shooting was capital. Stepan Arkadyevitch shot 2 more birds, and Levin 2, of which one was not found. It began to get dark. Venus, bright and silvery, shone with her soft light low down in the west, behind the birch trees, and high up in the east twinkled the red lights of Arcturus. Over his head Levin made out the stars of the Great Bear and lost them again. The snipe had ceased flying, but Levin resolved to stay a little longer, till Venus, which he saw below a branch of birch, should be above it, and the stars of the Great Bear should be perfectly plain. Venus had risen above the branch, and the ear of the Great Bear with its shaft was now all plainly visible against the dark blue sky, yet still he waited. "Isn't it time to go home?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. It was quite still now in the copse, and not a bird was stirring. "Let's stay a little while," answered Levin. "As you like." They were standing now about 15 paces from one another. "Stiva," said Levin unexpectedly, "how is it you don't tell me whether your sister-in-law's married yet, or when she's going to be?" Levin felt so resolute and serene that no answer, he fancied, could affect him, but he had never dreamed of what Stepan Arkadyevitch replied. "She's never thought of being married and isn't thinking of it, but she's very ill, and the doctors have sent her abroad. They're positively afraid she may not live." "What?" cried Levin. "Very ill? What is wrong with her? How has she—" While they were saying this, Laska, with ears pricked up, was looking upwards at the sky and reproachfully at them. "They have chosen a time to talk," she was thinking. "It's on the wing. Here it is. Yes, it is. They'll miss it," thought Laska. But at that very instant both suddenly heard a shrill whistle, which, as it were, smote on their ears, and both suddenly seized their guns, and 2 flashes gleamed, and 2 gangs sounded at the very same instant. The snipe, flying high above, instantly folded its wings and fell into a thicket, bending down the delicate shoots. "Splendid! Together!" cried Levin, and he ran with Laska into the thicket to look for the snipe. Oh yes, what was it that was unpleasant, he wondered. Yes, Kitty's ill. Well, it can't be helped. I'm very sorry, he thought. "She's found it. Isn't she a clever thing?" he said, taking the warm bird from Laska's mouth and packing it into the almost full game bag. "I've got it, Stiva," he shouted. End of chapter 15.